Hey guys, June here, and in this video I want to address one of the most commonly asked questions I get, which is something regarding whether or not you should be using a Steel Titan or a Nihil at any particular bossing location. For the sake of completeness, I'm going to use this opportunity to talk about all of the different familiars that we use throughout combat in RuneScape, as well as address some other points of confusion like the distinction between the Smoke and Ice Nihil that trip a lot of players up. All in all, by the end of this video you should have all of the information you need to consistently make the right decision for whatever your application requires. Let's get the simple stuff out of the way first by talking about everyone's best friend the Pack Yak, or alternatively the Pack Mammoth or any other beast of burden that you have access to. These are one of the most commonly used familiars, and they simply extend your inventory, allowing you to carry more supplies and thus conquer more difficult enemies or last longer on extended endurance type encounters. Their scroll also allows you to bank items, which can be super helpful if the enemy drops a lot of high value things that aren't noted. But the contrast to this is that they provide no benefit to your DPS, so if you don't absolutely need the extra inventory space and supplies, it would be much more preferable to use one of the alternative familiars that boost your damage in some way that we'll talk about shortly. Next up is the Unicorn Stallion, which used to be a very common familiar, but became dead content until it was the recent benefactor of a small patch to the way that its special attack scroll works. The Unicorn Special Attack Healing Aura heals the player of 10% of their maximum HP, which would be anywhere from about 1000 to 1500 HP depending on what kind of gear you're using, but the recent change is that this no longer costs the player adrenaline the way that eating other types of food does. Being able to heal this amount of HP without losing the adrenaline or reducing your stats by using things like Ceridome and Bruise is really beneficial to your DPS in situations where you need to eat consistently but not in super high amounts. The scrolls are also obviously stackable, which means this is by far the best stackable method of healing in-game, and although there is a sort of time restriction in the sense that your familiar summoning points are going to be drained so you can't necessarily use this as often as you want, you can use all of the surplus space in your inventory that normally would be filled with food and replace it with summoning potions to supplement those points. In that sense, the summoning potions are acting like your food, so that you can use this special attack as frequently as you need to get as much healing as you need without any adrenaline cost or stat drain. As such, you'll be able to get much better average damage output from your normal DPS rotation, and so this might be a wonderful choice for things like Yakimaru base tanking, where you're going to be eating very consistently. Next up is another extremely popular familiar that's also our first that's directly damage oriented. That is of course the Steel Titan, and although his base damage is respectable on its own, where the Steel Titan really shines is his special attack. This hits the primary target 4 times for up to 1296 damage per hit, or a total of up to about 5000 damage. If you're at some kind of an encounter that doesn't necessitate a lot of food, you can also fill your inventory with summoning potions or summoning flasks, and use them to supplement your summoning points to just infinitely span the special attack, dealing astounding amounts of damage. The only real drawback here is that he can't damage a few high-level bosses, specifically Araxor, Virago, Nex, or any of the brothers from Rise of the Six, and he's extremely inaccurate against a few rare enemies like the Scopulus at Virago. With the exception of those few bosses, this is your definite choice anywhere that you don't need access to any of the healing familiar options that we talked about earlier in the video. That begs the question, which of our choices is going to be best for the bosses that are immune to that basic familiar damage, and for that we have the Nihil. We have the Smoke and Ice Nihil for magic, we have the Shadow Nihil for ranged, and we have the Blood Nihil for melee, and if you commonly get confused as to which corresponds to which style, just remember that it's the same as the Tendril abilities that you unlock after the Dig Site quest. The benefit on these guys is that they give an invisible 5% accuracy bonus to the user in each of the respective attack styles, even if they're not able to directly deal damage to the enemy. This makes them the only familiar that can directly contribute to your DPS against an enemy that's immune to familiar attacks, which makes the Blood Nihil the best choice for Araxor, the Shadow Nihil the best choice for Nex, and the Smoke Nihil the best choice for Virago, for example. The Nihil's special attack Annihilate is relatively useless. It deals a small amount of damage and stuns the enemy, and the only place I could think of that this might be useful is if you're doing 100% telos kills in an attempt to set a speed kill record. This could give you the opportunity to stall his attack rotations basically indefinitely, as well as to capitalize on the stun combinations, which could increase your DPS quite significantly. However, the scrolls are also very expensive, owing to the fact that the pouches are expensive. With that said, you may have asked yourself by now why there are 2 different Nihil for magic, and this is one of the most common points of confusion with Nihil. Both the Smoke and the Ice Nihil give you that same invisible accuracy bonus, but the Ice Nihil was reported originally to have a debuff that decreased your opponent's stats as well. This led most people to sticking with Ice Nihil for the most part, even though they were more expensive than Smoke Nihil, but it turns out that that debuff is actually bugged. Apparently the only way the Ice Nihil can actually apply that debuff is if the Nihil itself is being summoned by an NPC, which obviously makes it useless for players, and makes it from the player perspective completely identical to the Smoke Nihil. There are a few circumstances where you might prefer to use a Nihil over a Steel Titan, even though the Steel Titan is able to deal its full effective damage against the enemy, particularly in situations where you need an ability that has an effect like the ability Debilitate to land on an enemy. For example, at Telos you may be relying on Debilitate to deal with the damage from one of his special attacks, and if that Debilitate splashes, you could find yourself KO'd out of nowhere by that damage. Situations like this, however, should be quite rare, and so the Nihil's only going to likely be a choice for those bosses which are immune to familiar damage. Finally, this brings us to our last choice of familiar, which is something I don't hear about commonly used, but are actually quite interestingly effective when used properly. These are the demon familiars made with some of the products that you receive from doing the demon flash mobs distraction and diversion, and these have a very interesting special attack. Each scroll releases an explosion that hits all enemies in a huge 9x9 area around the familiar for up to about 1000 damage each. You need to hit about 6 or more enemies in order for the DPS from this special attack to outclass the damage dealt by the Steel Titan unless the enemies you're fighting have relatively low HP. In that respect, it's a great choice for things like Slayer tasks where you would usually combine either a Scythe or a Dragon Rider Lance with aggression potions to group lots and lots of enemies together to do lots of AoE DPS like Abyssal Demons. These familiars also have a bonus effect in that they'll engage combat with other enemies of the same type that you're fighting, however this has been effectively rendered useless due to the existence of aggression potions. So thank you guys as always for watching. Hopefully this gives you guys the right information to clear up some of the misunderstandings around Nihils and Steel Titan that seem to plague the PVM community. As usual, the comment section and my private messaging are both on if you have questions. Big thanks to Zero Control and God's Paladin for their generous support on Patreon, and all of you for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.